A humble house caretaker is looking after a millionaire's house, but while cleaning he finds a photo of his wife with the millionaire. What he discovered left him paralyzed. The city lights were fading in the distance as Rodrigo drove his old Volkswagen sedan along the winding road leading to the outskirts. It was a cool spring night, and the breeze coming through the half-open window brought with it the scent of damp earth and renewal. Rodrigo took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. After a long day of work, this journey had become his little escape, a moment of peace before returning to his modest life. At 38 years old, Rodrigo had learned to appreciate the little things. Coming from a humble working-class neighborhood, he had to forge his own path in life from a very young age. His parents, tireless workers at the textile factory, had instilled in him values such as honesty, perseverance, and love for hard work. Although life never smiled on him with material abundance, Rodrigo remembered his childhood fondly, surrounded by the warmth of a united family. After finishing high school, Rodrigo was forced to abandon his dreams of pursuing a university degree. The economic situation at home was too precarious, and there was no way to afford higher education. Instead, he took a series of low-paying jobs, from construction worker to food delivery driver. Times were tough, but Rodrigo never complained. He was determined to get ahead by his own means. It was in one of these temporary jobs where he met Sofia. She was a beautiful young woman with big dreamy eyes and a captivating smile. She worked as a nanny for a wealthy family whose children Rodrigo occasionally looked after. From the moment he saw her, he was smitten by her grace and simplicity. To his surprise, Sofia also showed interest in him. They started dating, enjoying simple dates in public parks or walks around the city. Rodrigo marveled at how little Sofia needed to be happy. Unlike many other young women her age, she didn't seem dazzled by the expensive possessions and luxurious lifestyle of the families she worked for. Instead, she found joy in the simplest things: a sunset by the river, a shared ice cream, a movie night at home. For Rodrigo, Sofia was like an oasis of freshness in the middle of the relentless desert that was his life of exhausting work. With her, the dreams he had buried long ago began to bloom again. He dreamed of starting a family, having children, building a modest but love-filled home. Sofia seemed to share those aspirations, falling more and more in love with Rodrigo's humble but noble qualities. After 2 years of dating, with the few savings Rodrigo had managed to gather, they organized a simple wedding in the small park where they had their first date. It was an intimate celebration with only their closest family and friends as witnesses, but for Rodrigo and Sofia, that day represented the fulfillment of their most precious hopes. The first years of marriage were a sweet honeymoon despite the economic difficulties. Rodrigo worked tirelessly, taking construction jobs, gardening, and any other available employment. Sofia supported him unconditionally, stretching every penny of their salaries so the small family could get by. A ray of hope shone when Rodrigo got a steady job as a property caretaker for a company that managed the residences of wealthy families while they were away on trips. While the salary wasn't anything extraordinary, at least he had fixed income and some additional benefits. Sofia, for her part, continued working as a part-time nanny. In their modest one-bedroom apartment, Rodrigo and Sofia managed to live with dignity. They spent entire nights dreaming of being able to buy a small house, nothing ostentatious, but a place they could truly call their own. They planned to have children in the not-too-distant future and longed to provide them with a warm and stable home. However, circumstances always seemed to conspire against them. The savings they managed to gather evaporated quickly with some emergency or unforeseen expense. The dream of owning a home became more and more distant, as did the possibility of having children. But despite the constant frustrations, the love between Rodrigo and Sofia remained strong and unbreakable. It was in one of his jobs as a property caretaker where Rodrigo met Ernesto Villanueva, a wealthy businessman already in his later years. Don Ernesto, as Rodrigo respectfully called him, owned an impressive mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by vast gardens and a dream pool. The first time Rodrigo set foot on the property, he was stunned by so much opulence. From the elaborate architectural details to the expensive furniture and works of art, everything in that house screamed money. Even the smell, a mixture of cedar and leather, betrayed the owner's wealth. Don Ernesto hired Rodrigo to look after his mansion during a month-long business trip to Europe. It would be the longest stay Rodrigo would have on a property, but the generous tips Don Ernesto usually gave motivated him to do an impeccable job. The first weeks passed without major surprises. Rodrigo took care of basic maintenance tasks, watering the gardens, cleaning the rooms, making sure everything was in order. Sometimes, when he found himself alone in that immense house, he couldn't help but fantasize about what it would be like to live in a place like this. He imagined Sofia being the hostess of elegant parties, wearing beautiful designer dresses and jewelry. He imagined himself as a successful businessman who could give her all the luxuries she deserved. But those dreams were fleeting. Rodrigo knew his reality was very different. As he wandered through the endless empty hallways and rooms, he was aware of the abyss that separated his world from Don Ernesto's, an abyss that no amount of money could close. One afternoon, while cleaning Don Ernesto's private study, Rodrigo came across something unexpected. On one of the bookshelves, half hidden behind some heavy finance volumes, rested a framed photograph. He picked it up curiously, and what he saw made his blood freeze. In the image was a couple lovingly embracing on a paradisiacal beach. The woman, with radiant dark hair and a dazzling smile, was unmistakably his beloved Sofia. But the man was Don Ernesto himself, although quite younger and tanned. Rodrigo couldn't take his eyes off that photograph. There had to be a reasonable explanation, he told himself. Maybe they were just acquaintances captured in a friendly moment during family vacations. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, an unpleasant sensation was swirling in the pit of his stomach. How was it possible that Sofia and Don Ernesto knew each other? Why had his wife never mentioned this connection? Questions piled up in Rodrigo's mind, sowing the first seeds of doubt. From that day on, Rodrigo couldn't get that image out of his head. He observed it over and over again, studying every detail, every look, every gesture between that couple on the beach. With each glance, suspicion grew like a dark brushstroke darkening the canvas of his marriage. He tried to confront Sofia about it, but she denied even knowing Don Ernesto, claiming that Rodrigo must be confusing him with someone else. But he knew, deep in his heart, that the woman in that photograph was his Sofia. The remaining weeks in Don Ernesto's mansion were absolute torture for Rodrigo. Every corner, every room, every valuable object reminded him of the luxuries he could never give Sofia. He wondered if his modest life had been enough to keep her happy, or if she secretly longed for the same comforts enjoyed by people like Don Ernesto. Doubt became a worm that slowly ate away at his inner peace. Although Sofia acted normally, his mind wouldn't stop tormenting him with terrifying scenarios. What if she was cheating on him with rich men? What if she was only with him out of pity, secretly wishing for a more ostentatious life? At night, when Sofia slept peacefully by his side, Rodrigo remained awake, staring at the ceiling with his eyes wide open. The shadows came to life, drawing grotesque figures that seemed to mock his deepest fears. In those moments, loneliness and insecurity invaded him to the point of almost drowning him. When Don Ernesto finally returned from his trip, Rodrigo was a complete emotional wreck. His swollen eyes and the deep dark circles beneath them were a reflection of endless sleepless nights. As they said goodbye, the wealthy man seemed to notice Rodrigo's lost and worn-out look. For a moment, his eyes widened in alarm at the possibility that his valuable art collection might have been violated under this man's care. However, after a quick inspection of the property, Don Ernesto was satisfied and rewarded Rodrigo with a generous cash tip, much more substantial than usual. Rodrigo accepted the money with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact with his employer. Too many dark thoughts clouded his mind at that moment, too many unanswered questions. On his way back home, with the last rays of the setting sun bathing the interior of his old car, Rodrigo observed the city stretching out before him with a mixture of longing and apprehension. This city, which once seemed to him a hotbed of opportunities, now felt like a threatening maelstrom ready to devour him if he took a wrong step. Beside him, the crumpled wad of bills on the passenger seat was a bitter reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be part of the world of the rich, a world of unbridled excess and superficial pleasures to which his Sophia, his precious Sophia, perhaps longed to belong. With a broken heart and a troubled mind, Rodrigo now faced the greatest challenge of his life, discovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And at that moment, as the sunset painted the clouds swirling on the horizon in intense reds, he knew that nothing would ever be the same, regardless of the path he chose. The following days passed in a haze of confusion and anguish for Rodrigo. While fulfilling his daily routine of work and household chores, his mind kept replaying over and over the image of that photograph. The vision of Sophia, his beloved wife, so intimately embracing Don Ernesto on that paradisiacal beach had been seared into his memory. No matter how many times he turned the matter over in his head, he couldn't find a reasonable explanation. Sophia insisted that she didn't know that wealthy man, that Rodrigo must be confusing him with someone else. But he knew, deep in his being, that the woman in that photo was her. He would recognize that dazzling smile and those dreamy eyes anywhere. Uncertainty became a constant torment, a dark shadow that overshadowed every moment of his days. At night, while Sophia slept peacefully by his side, Rodrigo remained awake, staring at the ceiling with his mind working at full speed. Could it be possible that his wife was cheating on him? The very idea turned his stomach and caused a sharp pain in his chest. After all these years of love and devotion, after the countless battles they had fought together against adversity, had Sophia been hiding this from him all along? And if she had been involved with Don Ernesto and other wealthy men in exchange for money or expensive gifts? The horrible image of Sophia being some kind of luxury escort tormented Rodrigo, haunting him even in the deepest corners of his dreams. Every time he looked around, he saw the humble details of their modest home and wondered if it would ever be enough for Sophia. Did she long for the luxuries and opulence of the lifestyle led by Don Ernesto and his wealthy friends? Had she grown tired of the constant struggle to make ends meet? These doubts became a slow poison that corroded the trust and love Rodrigo felt for his wife. No matter how hard he tried to push those toxic thoughts out of his mind, they always came back stronger, slowly eroding the foundations of his marriage. In a desperate attempt to find answers, Rodrigo resorted to unethical methods that under normal circumstances he would have considered unacceptable. He began to stealthily search through Sophia's belongings looking for clues, any indication that could shed light on her apparent connection to Don Ernesto. At first, his searches were fruitless. He found nothing out of the ordinary, except for some expensive jewelry and clothing items that Sophia claimed to have bought with her savings from nannying. Rodrigo had his doubts about this, but he couldn't prove anything. Until one day, while checking the old desk that Sophia occasionally used, he found something that froze his blood. A thick envelope with several $1,000s in cash, carefully hidden between the pages of an old novel. With trembling hands, Rodrigo extracted the wad of bills and counted it frenetically. There were at least $10,000 there, an absolutely outrageous sum for their humble means. It was then that the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a terrifying way. The jewelry and expensive clothing, the sporadic but substantial amounts of cash that Sophia seemed to have out of nowhere, everything pointed to a heartbreaking conclusion. His wife was involved in some kind of financial arrangement with wealthy men in exchange for favors. The idea sickened him to his core. Rodrigo ran to the bathroom and violently vomited, clinging to the toilet bowl as tears of betrayal and agony ran down his cheeks. After so many years of struggling together against economic hardships, of staying faithful to each other despite the difficulties, how could Sophia have betrayed him in such a vile way? A whirlwind of dark emotions overwhelmed him: anger, pain, disappointment, disgust. Everything mixed in a maelstrom of anguish. He could barely breathe, overwhelmed by the nausea and heart-wrenching sobs that escaped his throat. In that state of devastation, he was barely aware that Sophia had returned home. She found him curled up on the bathroom floor, with the crumpled wad of bills in a clenched fist and his eyes red and swollen. "Rodrigo. What's happening? My God, you're shaking." Sophia knelt beside him, panic evident in her expression. For a moment, Rodrigo could do nothing but stare at her fixedly with a mixture of disbelief and revulsion burning inside him. This woman, the person he loved most in the world, had betrayed him in the most despicable way. Finally, after a pause that seemed like an eternity, the words burst from his lips like corrosive acid. "Where did you get this money, Sophia? From how many rich men have you been receiving it in exchange for your services?" Sophia's face completely changed. Her cheeks lost all color as her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and guilt. Rodrigo. "I can explain," she stammered, extending a trembling hand. But Rodrigo pulled away from her touch as if it burned him. He shook his head slowly, with a look of deep disappointment. "You have nothing to explain. Everything is clear now." His voice sounded harsh, almost unrecognizable from the bitterness that filled it. "While I've been killing myself working to support us, you've been rolling around with depraved rich men. Is that the luxury you longed for so much? The price you were willing to pay for an ostentatious lifestyle?" Sophia frantically shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Rodrigo, it's not what you think. Let me explain everything to you, please, I beg you." But Rodrigo didn't want to hear any more lies, any more excuses. With superhuman effort, he gathered the strength to stand up and face her. "I can't go on with this, Sophia," his voice sounded defeated, empty. "All my life I've loved and respected you. I gave you my heart completely, and you trampled on my trust in the cruelest way. I can't forgive that." Sophia broke into heart-wrenching sobs, begging on her knees for his forgiveness. But Rodrigo's heart was shattered. With one last look of infinite pain, he gathered some belongings and left that house they once called home. The days and weeks that followed were an endless torment for Rodrigo. He had moved to a small one-room apartment, barely enough to survive. Nothing made sense in his life anymore. He felt betrayed by the most important person, the one in whom he had placed all his faith. Work was his only refuge, a momentary escape from the emotional torment that consumed him day and night. He immersed himself fully in the tasks of property caretaker, sometimes spending entire days locked up without seeing anyone else. Occasionally, Sophia would appear with reddened eyes and a haggard face, begging for a chance to explain herself, to make amends. But Rodrigo couldn't even look at her without a wave of pain and revulsion overwhelming him. The memory of her betrayal was too fresh, the wound still bled. It was in those moments of raw loneliness when alcoholism began to take hold of Rodrigo. At first, it was just an occasional drink to dull the torment that gnawed at him from within. But little by little, it became an increasingly frequent habit, to the point where almost no day passed without him getting drunk. Alcohol became his only consolation, a temporary escape from the frightening reality in which he was immersed. Under its numbing effects, the images of Sophia with other men, the lacerating doubts, and the heart-wrenching pain faded away. At least for a few hours, he could forget his broken heart. However, alcohol also turned him into a different person, bitter and violent. On more than one occasion, he found himself involved in street fights or woke up the next morning with wounds and bruises, unable to remember their origin. His friends and family watched with growing concern his downward spiral towards self-destruction. They tried to intervene, offering their support and encouragement, urging him to seek professional help. But Rodrigo had locked himself in a shell of self-pity and bitterness, rejecting any attempt at rescue. Work was the only thing keeping him afloat, however precariously. Despite his deplorable condition, he managed to fulfill his obligations as a property caretaker. These were the only moments when he managed to push away the demons of alcoholism and betrayal. It was during one of these work stays that Rodrigo had an unexpected revelation. He was taking care of the mansion of a successful businessman, a place of excessive opulence with luxurious details in every corner. At first, the enormous house and its expensive belongings only awakened in Rodrigo a bitter sense of resentment towards the wealthy. But little by little, as he closely observed the details of this life of privilege, he began to see things in a new light. These rich men, for all their money and possessions, were alone. Most of them had broken families, alienated children, empty lives beyond superficial luxuries. Many of them seemed unhappy and bitter despite swimming in opulence. In his own way, Rodrigo understood that money isn't everything, that while it can buy material comforts, it absolutely does not guarantee happiness or true love. Suddenly, his humble origins and his values of hard work and united family no longer seemed like a burden, but a gift. It was then that Rodrigo began to reevaluate his situation. Was it really worth continuing to consume himself in resentment and bitterness? Was he going to allow the poison of betrayal to keep corroding his soul and destroying his life? No, he told himself with renewed determination. He was much more than that bitter and alcoholic man he had become. He was a fighter, someone who had forged himself through hard work and firm principles. At that moment, he made the decision to turn his life around 180 degrees. He would leave alcohol behind and seek a way to heal his emotional wounds. He would reconnect with his humble roots, with those values that had kept him standing for so long. And as for Sophia, maybe, just maybe, he could find in his heart a glimmer of forgiveness. It wouldn't be easy, much less quick, but he was determined to face his pain once and for all, with his head held high and renewed dignity. Because in the end, Rodrigo understood that true wealth does not lie in material luxuries or ostentatious possessions. True wealth is found in the integrity of the soul, in the inner strength to overcome adversities and move forward without losing the nobility of spirit. And he, humble Rodrigo, had always been richer than he ever imagined. Almost a year had passed since Rodrigo discovered the terrible truth about Sophia's infidelity and her apparent involvement with wealthy men in exchange for money and luxuries. A year of bitterness, alcohol, and self-destruction that almost brought him to rock bottom. But his recent epiphany, that reconnection with his humble roots and unshakable values, had given him back the determination to rebuild his life. He would no longer be the victim consumed by resentment and self-pity. Now was the time to confront his demons head-on and chart a new course. The first difficult decision was to quit alcohol. The violent withdrawal symptoms almost made him falter on several occasions, but Rodrigo stood firm. With the help of a detox program and the support of some concerned friends and family members, he managed to overcome the darkest moments of the process. The first 2 months sober were a real battlefield. Each day represented a constant struggle against the ghosts of the past that haunted him, against the demons that whispered that the only way out was to return to the bottle. But Rodrigo clung tooth and nail to his new determination. Little by little, his mind began to clear from the fog of alcoholism. He rediscovered simple pleasures he had abandoned, like reading a good book, enjoying a walk in the park, or preparing a home-cooked meal, small moments that reminded him of the simple beauty of a life free from excesses. In the moments of solitude, of wakefulness at night, Rodrigo couldn't help but let his thoughts drift toward Sophia. He mentally reviewed all the years of marriage, looking for any sign, however small, that might have anticipated her betrayal. But he found nothing. Only memories of happy moments and a love he had believed to be true. The image of Sophia embracing Don Ernesto on that paradisiacal beach still caused a lump in his throat. The question that tormented him the most kept running through his mind over and over again: why? Why had she, his companion in so many battles, his confidant and friend, decided to betray him in such a vile way? Rodrigo needed answers. He needed to look Sophia in the eyes and hear from her own lips the reason for her deception. Only then could he begin to heal the emotional wounds that still festered. Only then could he decide if there was a path back, however narrow it might be. So one night, after much pondering, he called Sophia. His tone was cold but determined when he asked her to meet him at a nearby cafe the next day. It wasn't a date, he clarified, just a necessary conversation to be able to move forward. Sophia, without hesitation, agreed to meet him. Rodrigo could perceive the desperation in her voice, that spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would have a chance to reconnect. The next day, Rodrigo arrived first at the cafe and chose a secluded table in a quiet corner. It wasn't long before Sophia appeared, almost unrecognizable. Her beautiful face was gaunt, with pronounced dark circles and an expression of perpetual anguish. When their gazes met, time seemed to stand still. For an instant, Rodrigo held his breath, feeling a sudden wave of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the memories of that betrayal still caused him a stab of pain. But on the other, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pity for the woman he once loved with every fiber of his being. Sophia stood motionless by the table, her eyes brimming with tears. Her lower lip trembled as she struggled to contain her sobs. "Ah, Rodrigo. Thank you for agreeing to see me." Her voice was barely a thread of sound. He nodded curtly and gestured towards the empty chair in front of him. For a few minutes, a tense and uncomfortable silence enveloped them as Sophia took her seat. Finally, Rodrigo cleared his throat. "I'm not going to beat around the bush, Sophia. I need to know the truth. The whole truth." His tone was icy, devoid of any emotion. "I need to know why you did it. Why you betrayed me in that way after everything we've been through together." Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, her gaze was filled with sorrow and remorse. "I know, Rodrigo, and I have no excuses. What I did was unforgivable." She paused to wipe away the tears streaming down her cheeks. "But if you allow me to explain everything to you, maybe you can come to understand it, even if just a little." Rodrigo observed her without blinking, his expression as immovable as a rock. With a slight nod of his head, he indicated for her to continue. Sophia took another deep breath before beginning her story. "I met Don Ernesto when I was still a nanny for his grandchildren. One day, after a family party, he offered to drive me home because he had had a couple of drinks. On the way, we started talking and we just connected." She shook her head slowly. "I know it's no excuse, but back then, you were working so many hours, Rodrigo. I felt so lonely, so unsatisfied with our lifestyle and the constant financial struggles. Don Ernesto represented everything I had always dreamed of: riches, luxuries, a dream life without worries. And he made me believe I could have it all if I got closer to him. I was a complete idiot." Tears were now flowing freely down her face. "At first, it was just some expensive gifts, jewelry, dresses, cash that he insisted on giving me. I knew it was wrong, but I convinced myself that there was nothing more to it. It was just a rich man indulging his whims, after all. But then things got out of control." Sophia stopped for a moment, her shoulders convulsing in silent sobs. She raised her gaze to Rodrigo with a flash of pleading in her reddened eyes. "Don Ernesto began to hint that if I wanted to keep receiving his favors, I would have to offer him something more substantial in return. And in a moment of absolute weakness, of idiotic greed, I agreed." Hearing those words, Rodrigo felt his world crumbling again. The verbal confirmation of the suspicions that had tormented him for so long was like a dagger plunging into his chest. He clenched his fists tightly, containing the urge to scream or break something. "Continue," the word came out as a hiss between his clenched teeth. Sophia nodded, tears now falling in an endless flow. "We would see each other in secret when you were working or away. There was intimacy between us." Her voice broke, and she had to pause again to regain her composure. "Don Ernesto filled me with expensive gifts and promised to please me in everything as long as I agreed to his special arrangements. At first, it was just a few intimate dates, but little by little it became the norm. And I let myself be carried away by greed and dreams of grandeur. It was as if I had become addicted to that lifestyle of luxury and opulence. I felt like I never had enough, I always wanted more and more. And the only way to get it was by selling my body and my dignity to the highest bidder. Sophia buried her face in her hands, sobbing bitterly. When she looked back at Rodrigo, her eyes were consumed by desolation. I don't know what was worse, the physical betrayal or the emotional one. I allowed greed and material desires to poison my love for you. I traded you for a handful of shiny trinkets, for the promise of a life of excess. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Rodrigo. I only deserve your contempt. A thick silence settled over them, interrupted only by Sophia's broken sobs. Rodrigo remained impassive, although inside, his entire world had crumbled. The words he had so feared to hear, horrible confirmations of his worst nightmares, had materialized. After what seemed an eternity, he finally broke his silence. All this time, I tried to find a reason, an explanation that made sense. But there isn't one, is there? He slowly shook his head. You changed everything we had, everything we fought for together for years, for a handful of trinkets and the promise of a hollow, empty life. He stood up abruptly, barely able to look Sophia in the eyes without feeling a lethal mixture of disappointment and revulsion. I would have moved heaven and earth to make you happy, Sophia. I would have given every breath of my life to provide you with a full and satisfying existence. But in the end, you chose the easy path, the path of betrayal and unbridled greed. Sophia looked up at him with eyes bulging in agony, pleading with her gaze despite her apparent perdition. Rodrigo, please, give me another chance. Let me show you that I can be better, that I can. But he no longer wanted to keep listening. The damage was done, and it was too deep, too heartbreaking. With a lump in his throat and hot tears threatening to spring from his eyes, Rodrigo slowly shook his head. I'm sorry, Sophia, but I can't. Not after this. His voice sounded hollow, broken. I have always loved you with all my heart, and that is the worst punishment I can receive, the love I felt for you, shattered and profaned in the worst imaginable way. Turning around to hide his own tears, Rodrigo left the cafe without looking back, leaving Sophia immersed in a sea of desperate sobs and laments. The days that followed were an emotional torment for Rodrigo. But this time, he stayed sober and firm on his path to recovery. Although the wound still bled, at least now he knew the whole truth. Sophia had betrayed him in the cruelest way, trading their love for worldly riches and superficial luxuries. It was a stab impossible to forget, a stain he would carry for the rest of his life. But Rodrigo was determined not to let himself be overcome by bitterness or resentment. Those were not his values, they never had been. Instead, he clung to what made him truly valuable as a human being, his integrity, his tireless work ethic, his nobility of spirit. Little by little, he began to rebuild the fragments of his life, focusing on what was truly important. He reconnected with old friends, resumed some simple hobbies he enjoyed like fishing and nature walks. Slowly, without rush but without pause, he was healing the emotional wounds with patience and perseverance. However, the memory of Sophia still continued to haunt him, though now not as a tormenting ghost, but as a sad reminder of how far the wrong paths chosen by a loved one can take us. A part of him still loved her, that was undeniable. But that love was now tinged with infinite sorrow, a grief for broken dreams and profaned trust. He knew he could never look at her the same way again, with that gaze full of adoration and unshakable faith. The blindfold had fallen from his eyes, and the Sophia he now saw was a broken woman, consumed by guilt and greed. Occasionally, she tried to communicate with him either through text messages or even sporadically appearing at his apartment. Her eyes red and swollen from crying, her face gaunt from anguish, were an inescapable reminder of the emotional damage she had inflicted on him. In these encounters, Sophia appeared more defeated than ever, a mere shadow of the vibrant and cheerful woman Rodrigo had loved in the past. She begged again and again for his forgiveness, for a second chance to prove that she could change, that she could find her way back. But Rodrigo had already made a decision. While he harbored no hatred towards her, he simply could no longer place his trust in Sophia. Not after such a deep betrayal. The love that once united them was dead, and although he desperately wanted to revive it, he knew in his heart that it would be a lost cause. So he listened to her in silence, with eyes shadowed by a resigned sadness. He allowed her to vent her guilt and her pleas, her promises of change. But in the end, he always responded with serene determination, "I'm sorry, Sophia, but that door is already closed for us." Deep down, a part of him knew he shouldn't hold a grudge against her. After all, they were both imperfect human beings, prone to stumble and make colossal mistakes. But the magnitude of her deceit, the blow to the love that had united them, was too great. However, despite the sorrow that still accompanied him, Rodrigo was beginning to feel at peace with himself.